So
I'm regaling them with my private life. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Today is the 3rd of April, 2018. This is a work session of the Portland City Council, and this is sponsored today by Commissioner Udaley. Commissioner, good morning.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce the first work session I've called to order since I've been in office. I feel like I've suggested some, but this is the first one to actually come to fruition. It's very exciting. So I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues for the continued engagement on the topic of how to protect our immigrant and refugee communities. It's clear to see that these communities are under attack and the need for local governments to act will only increase. We as council members are in a unique position to make decisions on this front that will immediately bring relief to vulnerable Portlanders. In 10 or 20 years, I'd hate to look back and reflect on this moment and think about missed opportunities rather than the actions we can be proud of. As you know, on March 1st, we accepted the report of the Welcoming Inclusive Sanctuary City Task Force. The task force identified the creation of a publicly funded universal defense program as a priority recommendation. I've been impressed by Oregon Ready's well-researched and innovative plan and look forward to discussing it with all of you today. And so I'm going to quickly introduce our presenters, Julie Stumpf, Leland Baxter-Neal, and Stephen Manning, and now turn it over to Andrea Williams for...
Sure. So thanks. I'm going to get us kicked off. Let's turn this on. There we go. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to review our universal representation concept. Today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about what this concept is, and we have wonderful, esteemed colleagues and experts. But I also wanted to acknowledge that in the room we have many of our partners who've worked over the course of the last 5 months to put this concept together, and those include Immigration Counseling Services, Catholic Charities, and SOAR, which is the Immigration Legal Services of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. And these are nonprofits that are experts in immigration law and have worked for decades with our immigrant and refugee community in the Portland area to help them navigate the very complex immigration system. And in the room, we also have our community organization partners, Latino Network and IRCO, who we've been in conversation with about the community navigator model and this concept broadly. So I want to thank them for being here, for taking the time. And I just wanted to say that there's been a lot of input on this concept. So while we have these presenters here today, they're representing a much larger set of people. And with that, I would turn it over to Juliet.
Great. Well, just turn this on.
If you leave about 6 inches, that's about the right
great.
distance. These are pretty sensitive microphones.
To know. Is that going to work? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here and for listening to what we have to say about universal representation. I'm an immigration law professor. I teach both immigration law and civil procedure at Lewis and Clark Law School. And actually, both of those courses and areas of study have informed my thinking about this. What I do every year in my immigration law classes, I invite my students, actually assign my students to go to immigration court and just sit in the back of the classroom for an hour or two and observe what happens in court. So this was actually the first year that I was able to go with them. And three weeks ago, I sat in the back of the courtroom with 6 of my students, and we watched maybe 15 to 20 people come through the immigration court for their preliminary hearings. They're called master calendar hearings, and they tend to be very quick. The Portland Immigration Court is set up kind of like a regular courtroom. There's a judge in the front. There's 2 tables and 2 big leather sort of swivel chairs for each table. And on the left side, the government attorney sits there with her computer. On the right side is where the respondents sit. And one of the things that struck me, there were 2 things that struck me on that day. One was that I watched a father come up to the front, sit at the table, and then help his 3 or 4-year-old son into the chair next to him. And it wasn't really until, I mean, I know this, I study immigration law and how it works, but it wasn't really until the judge called the case that I realized that this wasn't a situation in which, right, the father hadn't had the opportunity to get daycare for his child. When the judge called the case, he was calling the father's name and the child's name as well. So the child was just as much subject to that deportation proceeding as his father was. The other thing that struck me was, of all of the people that we saw in that courtroom for that hour and a half to 2 hours, only one of them had an attorney. So when we walked into the courtroom was full of families, right? Parents with young children. You know, the father with the young boy was just one of the families who was there. And so to see the government attorney on the one side and the family members, the individuals on the other, it really brought that situation home to me. So what I want to lay out a couple of things, right? So last March, Portland declared itself a sanctuary city, right? Mayor Wheeler, you said, we are not going to be complicit in the deportation of our neighbors. And that was an incredibly important statement at that moment in time, because the administration that had just been elected was very clear about its intentions with respect to immigrant communities of color. It was also a statement that was really just telling it like it is, right? Oregon is an immigrant state, and Portland is an immigrant city. So immigrants are key to our prosperity as a state and as a city. And I just want to actually lay out a little bit of data to back up your statement. I know you probably know some of this already.
Could I just interrupt, because we did have a hearing on this, and I don't think you need to explain to any of us why this is an important thing for us to do.
Okay.
I thought that the...
I wouldn't mind hearing just the data points.
Sure, absolutely.
I don't disagree with you, but since I have to give a State of the City speech, these might be...
Oh, nice. Well, they're also in the report that we'll be giving you. But just to lay out the very...
That's sufficient.
Okay, great. That sounds good. Okay. Then let me skip forward, actually, to our slides.
Down.
Awesome. There we go. Great. Okay, so this is what we can skip, actually. And we'll go straight to mass deportation and incarceration, right? Because what I want to lay out just very quickly is the idea that people are being deported who actually have pathways to legalization. And this data is actually quite important. The most important data point, I think, is that about 80% of unrepresented Oregonians whose deportation cases are decided on the merits at the Portland Immigration Court will be ordered deported. So, and the vast majority of those people, right, will be people of color. So one of the things that struck me in the back of the courtroom, right, in thinking about this is, why is that statistic so high? If you think about it, just from that perspective, the federal government is represented in immigration court 100% of the time. And they're represented by somebody who is trained in immigration law. They're trained not just in immigration law, but in procedure, right, the procedures of immigration law. And their job is to pursue deportation, right? That's what they're supposed to do. So they know the law and they know the rules of the game. So what that means is, when we think about universal representation, what is it that we're doing, right? Representation means that a non-citizen is 3.5 times more likely to prevail in their deportation proceeding than people without representation, right? So people who are prevailing, what that means is that they're more likely to secure stable immigration status. They're more likely to match their immigration status with their community status, with membership in Portland and membership in the Oregonian community. Why does that happen? It's because lawyers on the immigrant side also know the law and they also know the rules. They know the procedure, right? So they are able basically to help people not just keep from being deported, right, but find those pathways to legalization that Congress created, right, that the immigration court allows non-citizens to have. So I will stop there except to say one more thing, and that is, when we have representation of immigrants, the significance of that is that has a ripple effect. It's not just the immigrant, right, who is being saved from deportation, who obtains that legal status. It's also their children, their employees, right? It's all of Oregon and Portland who are able to use the taxes that people who are legalized are able to provide, who are able to use the spending power that immigrant consumers are bringing forward to the community, right? So deportation and representation has these kinds of ripple effects that actually affect all of us. So I'll stop there and turn things over to Stephen and Leland.
So my name is Leland Baxter Neal. I'm an immigration attorney at Metropolitan. My name is Leland Baxter Neal. I'm an immigration attorney at Metropolitan Public Defenders in a small immigration project that the city helped launch last year, so thank you. I am going to be very brief and kind of just jump to a couple of points so we can get on to the discussion. I wanted to quickly define and clarify a couple of concepts that we're going to be working with today, one of which, right, is very general. It's what is removal and deportation. So removal is deportation. So we use the term removal proceedings. We're talking about deportation proceedings. And that begins with ICE enforcement. So immigration enforcement is here locally, ICE going out in plainclothes, unmarked vehicles, grabbing people off the street, putting them in literally an unmarked van, and disappearing them often out of the community. They refuse to identify themselves. There's well-documented violations of state law, of constitutional law in their enforcement. We know that under the Trump administration, ICE enforcement is used as honestly, a terrorizing tactic. And it's used as a bully tactic against jurisdictions like Oregon, like Portland, that have stood up and asserted sanctuary policies, right, which we know are well-founded in the 10th Amendment and with basic concepts of federalism. We've had a federal judge decide and tell us that compliance with ICE detainers are unconstitutional. Yet the Trump administration takes that as a personal affront and has targeted our communities in a pretty gross and intense way. So after someone's arrested by ICE, if they're able to get their case into immigration court, and not all cases do, but when cases go into immigration court, they face the sort of asymmetrical and unfair system that Professor Stump was laying out, right? An attorney who spends their career immersed in one of the most complex bodies of law in the US Code. And at the other table, we know at least 35% of folks coming through Portland are unrepresented. But what the numbers actually show when you drive down is that new cases, so in Multnomah in the last 90 days, 70% of those folks are not represented. And what you have is the federal government taking that asymmetrical system and turning it up to 11, right? They're doing everything in their power to make our immigration system into a mass deportation system. And one of the biggest obstacles to that is lawyers. And so they actively implement policies and take stances in courts and lawsuits to create obstacles to legal representation, right? The quota system and the speeding up system that we're seeing is intended, right, to keep folks, because it takes a while for someone to find an attorney, especially when you have a saturated local market, when you've got tons of folks looking for legal representation and those offices filled up. The nonprofits generally have not historically been funded to do removal defense. So it's hard and it takes time. And when you impose these really fast timelines, when you impose these other policies, you actually push down the numbers. So while maybe court-wide right now, Multnomah, the Portland Immigration Court is around a 35% unrepresented rate. It's really likely with 3 attorneys and new policies that unrepresentation rate is gonna spike. In the midst of this, right, Portland is being targeted. So what you'll see is a statewide map broken down by county subdivision. And if you flip to the next page or the next slide, you see that in fact, the 2 most heavily targeted counties are Washington County and Multnomah County. And when looked at a county subdivision level, it's the Portland Hillsborough, the Hillsborough Beaverton County, Hillsborough and Beaverton, and then East Portland are the 2 most heavily targeted county subdivisions in the entire state of Oregon. Currently, there's nearly 600. So these numbers are old, and what we're seeing is nearly a rate of 1 a day. So likely it's now well over 600 individuals who have East Portland addresses who have pending cases in immigration court. There were 80 arrests in the last 90 days of Multnomah County residents, 55 of those out of East Portland. And those are the folks where about 71% are unrepresented. So this is a very intense local issue. And I won't belabor the point. We can discuss it more in the discussion, but I believe that not only should Oregon, but Oregon must and Portland should lead in providing funding for removal defense. Oregon was the first sanctuary state in the country, and we are the last one on the West Coast without public funding for removal defense. There are sanctuary jurisdictions across the country that are providing public funding for removal defense, and nowhere in Oregon can that be found. With a federal government engaged in a project, a race-based project of mass deportation detention, bullying Oregon by targeting our immigrant communities because of our sanctuary jurisdictions, the only way to fulfill that promise of sanctuary is to fund removal defense. And in doing so, not only does Portland lead, it has the opportunity to learn, as Stephen will explain, from all of the other projects that have popped up, best practices and improvements on that. We can lead in innovation, but it's going to have economic benefits, it's going to have social benefits, it's in line with Portland's equity goals, it furthers those equity goals, and honestly, it's the right thing to do at this historical moment. So I'm going to pass it to Stephen to discuss kind of the details of what we're proposing.
So my name is Stephen. Thank you for taking your time to be here today. So these are 3 things I want to do. So I want to describe the model at a meta level. Then I want to talk about the cost of the model, and then I'd like to describe how it actually works on the ground in the field, how it's intended to work. And if, obviously take questions at any time. I feel like I'm presenting, it's like ready for the en banc panel. So deportation has been weaponized, right? It's been weaponized against immigrant communities of color. It's been weaponized here in Portland. We're seeing that. And so the task that we had with ourselves, like that we, sort of the equity core, when we created the equity core, the concept, it's like, can we get to the other side of the Trump administration and to be in a better space, right? Can we be in a space actually having systemic change, right? So what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a model that would, at the end, rule of law would be intact, and inclusion and equity would be embedded in democracy, right? And so that we wouldn't be fighting these battles against. We're really aiming, so the equity core model, the core model, like uses lawyers as tools, right, through the mechanism for us to be able to obtain this systemic change. So the concept isn't to provide legal services strictly for legal services' sake, but we want to fund legal services to have the permanent change. And so that's the concept behind it, right? Now it does it through a couple innovative mechanisms. So one is the scaling mechanism, and the other is the collaboration mechanism. And the collaboration also includes a lot of intensive data aggregation, so we can understand who is being helped. So we're going to be collecting more than 250 unique data points that have never been collected on this population, in addition to the service providers, right? So how do we actually do this, right? So we're going to be collecting intensive data throughout the process and aggregating it throughout the entire system. So anyways, so meta level. The system is based around the concept of providing direct legal services. So there's direct service attorneys, so there's 4 components. A direct service attorney, there's a navigation services, so community-based navigation services. There's what we call hosting services, so an organization who is hosting one of the attorneys, one of the direct service attorneys. And then there's clearinghouse services. And clearinghouse services, that's a central organization supporting doing the data aggregation, the data analysis, and supporting all the strategic and tactical development of those lawyers. Because what we've learned in using this similar model in other high capacity, high stress, ideologically distorted spaces is that keeping the lawyers, the direct service attorneys, focused on doing direct service lawyer work, what I call keeping the lawyer in the lawyer's mojo, and allowing the system to actually decide what happens next and how things move forward, how things progress and do the data aggregation, we end up with amazing client outcomes that adhere to the law, right? So we actually rebalance the asymmetry.
Stephen, is this model one that is currently in use in other jurisdictions? Is it based on other jurisdictions?
It is. So it is, right now it's used in two of the largest immigrant defense initiatives in the nation. So one is it's called the Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative. And it's a collaboration. It's being operated by the Southern Poverty Law Center in collaboration with other organizations similarly like this, sort of this collaboration. And then there's called the Dilley Pro Bono Project, which operates in South Texas. On this very same model. And the same model has now gone through a couple iterations. We actually sort of created the model in response to the sort of the beginning of the mass detention incarceration. And then we've been continually iterated based on the sort of dynamic adaptation as we get data.
So is the former model, is that a collaborative between multiple jurisdictions, the Southeast Immigrant?
The Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative? Yes, so it spans right now 4 detention centers in the southeastern United States, so in Georgia and Alabama. And
is there any opportunity here, not because I'm cheap, but because we have a very, very challenged budget cycle, and assuming we like what we hear, and I don't think we'd all be here if we didn't, is there an opportunity to collaborate with other jurisdictions, perhaps to the north of us?
Yes. So for example, and I can talk a little bit about some of the numbers, right? Both the cost and numbers served. So in Seattle, so they have their legal defense fund, and it's a collaboration between the Northwest Immigrant Justice Project and sort of the navigator component called Collectiva. And they are providing services on a similar model with there's some differences because of the way that the funding was distributed, but it is a model that would resonate. And it's also, we are in conversations with them because a lot of individuals in Oregon actually end up in the Tacoma Detention Center. And so figuring out that collaboration piece. And so we are in close contact with them. So
when Portland residents get taken to Tacoma, do they then have representation there paid for by Washington?
So they will not be, this is the way I understand the way that the ground rules work, they will not be represented through the funding stream from the public dollars through the Legal Defense Fund. The Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, though, has funding separate through private philanthropy that they will be providing some minimal level of representation through Know Your Rights and legal orientation programming.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that's something that we dealt with when we were looking at what can we do for the DACA students, that we had to be really careful that Portlanders' tax money goes to help Portlanders. And so when we're looking at the numbers that you have, actually there's more people in Washington County, in particular Beaverton, Hillsborough, who are being taken to the detention center here. So I think that's part of the mayor's question as well, as, both an interstate collaboration and funding model, but it sounds like they similarly don't want Washington's taxes to go to pay to help Oregon residents. Is that correct?
I mean, I don't want to speak for however they've allocated their funding, but the way we've been thinking about how to actually do the model. So, for example, the model here is intended to allow other public entities to contribute funding and allow it to scale, right? So with initial funding from the city of Portland, we would actually intend to serve individuals who would fall within the resolution, so the sanctuary resolution. So individuals who contribute to the collective prosperity of Portland, so individuals who live and work in the city of Portland would be eligible for services under this, from funding from Portland, is how we would initially do the scope of service. And then as additional jurisdictions participate, we'd be able to expand that scope of service through the scaling mechanism built into the model. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. Okay. So then the clearinghouse services. So the clearinghouse services is actually we would be using and adapting and collaborating with the other organizations around the country who use the similar clearinghouse service. So both the SciFi, so the Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative, the Dilley Pro Bono Project, and other organizations that use the clearinghouse services. We would be scaling through that mechanism as well. The final is what we call the case fund. So if we're talking about individuals who are indigent or unable to afford an attorney, we're also assuming that they're also unable to afford certain basic case costs. And so the case fund would be an allocation based on the number of cases that go to the defense team. Right now we're using it structured around a deductible model. I'm not sure deductible is the right word, but the idea being that an individual based on their income, they would be expected to contribute a certain amount of their case costs for like records requests or expert fees, as well as the clearinghouse being able to aggregate those services. And up to a certain point, that individual would then be expected to pay, and that at that point, then the fund would kick in up to a certain amount. And right now, I think that number is $250 or $500. I can't remember. It's at $500. So that's how the model works at a meta level, right? So the scaling mechanism is pretty straightforward. There's funding is allocated around the direct service attorney, and each time there's a direct service attorney that's funded, then the rest of the model grows organically and grows like it scales like proportionately, so that it's always in sync, so that we don't have a what do I want to say, like the upstream and downstream. It's exactly the throughput would maintain itself, right? And that comes out in the cost. So in the costs for year one, right, so we're looking at serving up to 500 individuals. Year two, close to 1,000 individuals, and year three, about 1,800 individuals. Year one cost is right 976,000. Year two is about $1 million. Year three is 1.2. The case cost per individual served drops as the system scales. So it goes from around 2,000 down to 700 by the third year. Those numbers are very much in line with our Seattle colleagues. So the Seattle, we're also substantially, our comparable price point is compared to the LA Justice Fund, so the system that's in operation in Los Angeles County. Their numbers right now, so we're about 33%. We bring in the same services and actually probably enhanced services at 33% less than what the LA Justice Fund is doing right now.
Could I just ask a clarifying question on the numbers? Because I really appreciate you sending the Equity Core memo as well as ahead of time. That was very helpful. And on page 5, it says that in 2016, the Portland Immigration Court issued final decisions in 281 cases where the parties were unrepresented. And it said that 243 Multnomah County residents currently in deportation proceedings are unrepresented. So why the difference between those numbers and the 500?
It's a great question. So there's two reasons why. So one, they've added an additional judge to the court. That new judge was, so right now, those numbers were generated with 2 judges. There's now 3 judges. And our Attorney General just issued an order 3 days ago indicating that the judges must accelerate the deportation process. So that's the first answer. The second answer is not everyone who appealed, those are decisions on the final decisions on the merits. And if you look at the total docket, so everyone who's on the docket, this system is designed to help everyone who's on the docket, right? And so as their case is moving forward, we would then be placing them, so they come into the system at the earliest stage possible, because that means that we can do a lot of preventative work, right? They come into the system at the earliest stage possible, and by the time they're at their immigration court hearing, when you're seeing that number, we're already ready to defend that case. So there's a part of the model to actually talk about what we call the pro se support mechanism within that we would be supporting during that process, right? Which is where a lot of the cost benefits come from, because we're using skilled individuals to provide services at the lowest price point possible, rather than saying that an attorney needs to be doing all of the work all the time, and that actually can become an expensive proposition. So that's the cost, numbers served. The model goes through, actually, can you advance that? So there's 6 stages to the model, the way the model works, right? And the idea is that we're trying to create permanent change, right? So we have a navigation, screening, sorting, supporting, placing, and defending, right? And I'm just gonna walk through those real briefly, and then pretty much, I think the names are fairly self-explanatory, right? So navigation, working with community partners, funds are available for navigators, both for paid staff navigators who would be doing a couple things, right? So they'd be working with training additional community navigators. So those would be volunteers. They could be volunteers with other organizations within working in the immigration space. They could be other city or county. They could be public health nurses. They could be librarians, other individuals who have contact with the population who could be engaging these individuals. The navigators run community-based workshops and know your rights workshops. And they would actually be doing intakes and screening. So within this concept of navigation, these are the individuals who are having direct contact with the population, and they would intake these individuals and do a base level screening, determine eligibility. And eligibility, there's probably 3 core principles around eligibility right now. One is the service area, so how we define the service area. One is the income screening, so right now it would be based on 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, which is the same measure that both the Washington and the LA Justice and the California, the Bay Area folks are using. As well as that the person is not already represented. So they don't actually have a lawyer, they're not eligible for some other services. So there's other services, for example, funding is provided for individuals who are victims of trafficking, some funding is provided for individuals who are victims of different types of domestic abuse. Those individuals, if they're already represented through a different program, then they wouldn't need these dollars, this funding, to be represented. But if they're not, then they would be eligible for these services.
Could I ask a question? I'm sorry to jump around here a bit. What is the difference between operations and support?
And so operations, so support goes to the pro se support attorney, as well as so each hosting organization would necessarily need to build out infrastructure to support that attorney that is placed there. So for example, they would need additional reception service. They would need additional like paralegal support. And that's what support goes to, as well as the pro se support attorney, who would be providing logistical, tactical, and strategic support during the process.
Yeah, and if I can just real quickly, I think it might, what we're talking about is the Central Clearinghouse, right, has basically one attorney who's helping the direct service, actually let me back up. 5 direct service attorneys placed in different existing nonprofits who are the ones doing the representation for immigrants in removal proceedings. Those attorneys, they are supported by a clearinghouse. That clearinghouse is what he mentioned, right? There's technical, strategic advice, there's access to documents, all of these things that help those lawyers do their job not only better, but then takes all of what they're doing and puts it part of one larger strategy, right? So that's that support mechanism, and then those are those attorneys, and then the system is fed into by the navigators who are bringing folks into the system.
So what is operations then?
So, operations, operations is, what is operations? So operations go to, so actually was Leland's description is the accurate description, and my description was the inaccurate description. So Leland's description of the support services, that's mostly the clearinghouse support services. Operations is what I was describing. So operations are going to be sort of the overhead of the individual. It's going to be the infrastructural development of for each of the nonprofit organizations that will be hosting. It'll be what they need to do to be able to support that individual attorney. Whereas the support services are going to come from the clearinghouse. So navigation, that's community-based navigation. The screening, so individuals, we're using a data aggregation model, a collective screening system. So individuals, navigators, other hosting organizations, community partners, as individuals come in contact, they'll be entered into, they'll go through an online application. The application is partially automated and partially, like there's always human intervention. They're going to be looking to see if they're minimally eligible for the services. If they're minimally eligible for the services, so there's like a prima facie screening, they would then get reviewed by a human who's going to make sure that that individual is eligible for services, and they're going to go into what we call the case pool. Once in the case pool, 2 things happen. So there's a sorting and a supporting process. So individuals are sorted by priority or non-priority. So individuals who are at imminent risk of removal, they're going to get flagged in the system and they're going to get moved to the front of the queue. And individuals who are not at imminent risk of removal, and the way we're defining that is based on the court docket. So do they have a hearing right now within the next 6 months? If they do have a hearing within the next 6 months, we need to get them to the defenders right away. If they don't have a hearing within the next 6 months, we're going to be able to support them at a lower price point through the support mechanism. So that's using the pro se support model, which will be distributed amongst the participating host organizations. Once they are at that imminent stage where we need to place them with the defense team, we place them. That placing we're actually incorporating, again, to build the efficiencies, is a collaborative placement process amongst all the defense attorneys. It would happen in a randomized queue so that we're actually defending everyone who needs to be defended. And we're also incorporating pro bono firms in this, right? So right now there is a pro bono project that's operating here in Portland, and we're going to be bringing that project in here with the idea being that we'll be placing what we would call the outlier cases, so the cases that would be extremely complex or would be extremely difficult to defend within the price point that we're suggesting. We would actually place them with pro bonos and allow those pro bonos equally to participate in the process. Then during the defense process, so that's when the case is actually placed with the lawyer. That lawyer is now actively defending that case, using the clearinghouse support services to bring that case to a successful conclusion. So those are the steps of the model. And that's what I got.
So, Leland, I think you mentioned that when people are apprehended that only a certain percentage of them actually go for a deportation hearing. What happens to the others?
So there are provisions in immigration law for basically deportation without judicial review. There's various different ways that happens. Sometimes that's related to folks who have previous orders of deportation, so at some point a court, whether that person was there in the courtroom or not, may have ordered that person deported. Mm-hmm. It has to do with crimes that have been alleged. So the criminal component of immigration law is highly complex because it's based on federal law and not state law. But certain individuals who have been, ICE will say, well, you've been convicted of this crime, and this crime qualifies under federal law as this very bad type of crime, and because you've been convicted, we're going to deport you without judicial review. So there is this sort of class of shadow deportations that happen without judicial review.
Okay. And so the budget you're proposing, does this fund just the fellows, the attorneys? Or does it also fund the navigators and ancillary services at the nonprofit organizations?
It funds it all.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a lot of money to do all that.
I'm glad you think so.
I mean, 5 attorneys? Is it 5?
It's actually 6 attorneys because there's what we call the pro se support attorney.
And these are salaried employees of the nonprofit?
Yes, they would be, yes.
Okay. I mean, that's got to be $75,000 to $100,000 each.
Yeah, it's so each unit of like what I would call like the fellowship unit is about $192,000. So for each attorney that you add to the system, it's another $192,000, and that actually pays for the rest of the services supporting that attorney as well.
Oh, that pays, okay. But not the navigators.
And the navigators.
Oh, and the navigators?
That's
so
right.
like each package is like, there's the attorney salary, and then there's a component of a navigator salary. There's a component of the cost that it takes to run that document library at the clearinghouse. There's a component of the expert defense attorney that's providing the strategic support. Sort of all of those components are priced out. So every time you add a new attorney, right? So this is a scaling method. You add attorney, the whole system organically sort of expands to support that attorney. So you never have an imbalance between the number of attorneys out doing the field services and those support systems, right? The support systems are always there. And it works in the opposite, right? So suddenly Oregon goes from 2 judges to 1 judge, and Trump disappears, and somebody else comes in, or the ecosystem somehow changes and the number of folks needing representation drops, you can then scale the system down in the same way, right? By removing funded attorneys out, which decreases the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And another way of thinking about this is, this is actually exactly what corporate law firms do, right? They're trying to set up we're trying to set up a system where the people with the most expertise, the most expensive people, are doing the work that they have the most expertise in. And all of the other work, right, is placed with other people who have particular expertise in that way. So that the attorneys aren't doing the functions that the navigators and paralegals and other attorneys would, other people would be doing. It's kind of like exactly what a corporate law firm would do.
So I have questions for each one of you, and we only have the mayor for about 18 more minutes. I want to try to get through as much as possible. We glossed over the kind of the prosperity section that you had, but I do think it's very relevant to this conversation because the way many members of the community are going to see this is that we're taking on a liability, we're giving money away, and so I think it's absolutely essential for us to understand and us to communicate to the public that not only do these individuals contribute to our prosperity as a city and a state, but what the federal government is doing to them is costing us. So if you want to speak to that at all, please do. Otherwise, I'm happy to have that statement on the record.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to speak to that and just to lay out a couple of ideas about that, if that makes sense. So in thinking about Oregon's prosperity, Portland's prosperity, and how immigrants are an integral part of that, that has everything to do with who immigrants are within our community, right? So immigrants comprise 13% of the state's workforce. It's Oregon's immigrant-led households that have paid nearly $737 million in state and local taxes. That's a 2014 figure. Undocumented immigrants, right, they comprise 4.8% of the workforce, and they contribute about $81 million in state and local taxes. People don't really think about that. They think undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, but they do, and they do for really good reasons. And just focusing in on DACA recipients, right, so people who've received deferred action for childhood arrivals, they've paid an estimated $20 million in state and local taxes. And if you also think about immigrants as consumers, so Oregon's spending power in 2014 was about $7.4 billion. Those numbers, when you think about that and you think about the heightened deportation, heightened detention, right? What happens when those immigrant communities of color are targeted by the federal government is that we as a community lose that, right? And we lose not just that kind of spending power, we also lose the integrity and the stability of our immigrant families. So, and immigrant families are not just, composed completely of immigrants, right? Immigrant families are mixed status families. So, and I actually have some statistics on that. 1 in 8 Oregon residents is a native-born U.S. citizen with at least one immigrant parent. 1 in 12 Oregon children, that's 71,000, is a U.S. citizen living with at least one undocumented parent, right? So I said that already. But nearly 90,000 U.S. citizens in Oregon live with at least one family member who's undocumented. So when you take that family member away, particularly when that family member is either a breadwinner or the core of the family, right? Someone who holds that family together. It's the state and the city that ends up picking up the pieces.
Yeah, thank you.
May I add a little? So a study was undertaken where by moving individuals to more stable immigration status, we actually would be increasing the amount of paid in local and state taxes here in Oregon by $40 million. So. By this program itself, by moving individuals to more stable status, which you have to do to be able to defend in court, these individuals will be better able to contribute to our collective prosperity.
And Leland, you indicated that people were being targeted for removal based on race. Can you give us a breakdown of specific communities? Because I think the impression is this is all about people coming from Mexico, because we're so focused on the wall and what, but it's actually people from across the globe.
Oregon has a really broad cross-section of an immigrant community, right? We're home to folks who have come here for any number of reasons from different countries from across the globe. We have a large amount of refugee populations and asylees. We have folks that have come here for work. We have folks who have come here from safety, folks who have come here for any number of reasons. And it's important to remember that immigration enforcement targets not just undocumented individuals. Undocumented individuals in itself is a term that really needs some unpacking, because undocumented, all it means is that it's someone whose lawful status hasn't been decided yet. Right? It doesn't mean that that person doesn't have a lawful right to be in the United States. It just means that there hasn't been an opportunity, right? Immigration removal proceedings is actually a place where that happens. So that's kind of what's underlying a lot of this. Is when we talk about providing removal defense actually provides stability, it's because it's a pathway through which the law states that an individual who doesn't have recognized lawful status can gain lawful status. And not just gain, and I don't mean gain like that's not something they had before. It means the government can finally recognize that this person has a lawful right to be in the United States. Removal proceedings can be initiated against undocumented individuals, people with asylum. It can be initiated against refugees. It can be initiated against people here on special immigration programs. Anybody who's not a U.S. citizen, there is some provision in the U.S. Immigration Code that allows for them to be deported. And what we know is not only that, ICE has a track record of arresting and beginning deportation proceedings against U.S. citizens, right, even successfully. And it's really hard sometimes to prove your lawful right to be in the United States without an attorney. What we know is that without attorneys, the number of people who even apply for status to remain in the United States is terribly small. When you add an attorney, just the act of applying for eligibility increases dramatically. Why? Because most of us at this table can't name, most people who aren't in immigration law probably can't name more than one or two ways to access status, right? And so how would we expect someone who's probably hearing removal proceedings in a language that's not their own and going through a legal system that is entirely foreign to them to know that they're affirmatively supposed to say certain magic words to open the doors to the status to which they're eligible? So the
main communities that are being targeted, Somali, I believe, Haitian, that's what I'm trying to get at.
So when when nationality is the sort of the marker for race, and it often is in immigration, then we are talking about Somali, Haitian, we're talking about Iraqi, Iran, we're talking about Salvadoran, Mexico, we're talking about Guatemala, we're talking about we're talking about Vietnam, we're talking about Laos, and we're probably talking as well about the Philippines. That'd be my rough rubric.
And just to add to your point, and when I say that it's race-based, I say there's ample evidence, both anecdotal and broad studies, that ICE routinely uses different types of racial profiling to find and target individuals for removal, right? So we could talk about that. I don't have any of that data here that I really want to speak to, but we know that it's integral to their operations is focusing and finding individuals based on their race.
And then Stephen, if you could just briefly talk about how vital it is that we intervene at the earliest stage before people are removed and taken up to Tacoma.
It's critical because, I think, prevention is that's the whole concept. By actually bringing people to stable status sooner rather than later, we actually avoid all of these other consequences and costs entailed with the deportation and detention process. So intervening at the very first possible moment actually allows for the system, the lawyers, the support system to gain status for an individual, bring that person to stability before the other negative ancillary costs have taken effect, and actually then we can take that person off the docket, and that person now is contributing to the collective prosperity.
Great, thank you.
So we talked about this at the last hearing, but how can you assure us that none of these dollars will be used for criminal defense or for defending people with that are being deported based on prior criminal convictions? Are those assurances you can give us?
So the first one, yes. The second one, I'm not sure that's, so the second one, no, and there's a reason why. So the first one, so this would be, so these are individuals who are providing immigrant defense services, not criminal defense services. And there's a separate, when someone individual is being charged with a crime, there's a separate system that kicks in, and so that's where that happens.
Okay.
The second question, though, I would like, in order for the system to work, the rule of law has to apply, and we can't apply, at least in my view, we can't create a system that says some people don't merit the rule of law. And the reason why the government's able to achieve its deportations rate, because it's already externalized and excluded individuals from that rule of law system. And by creating another system on top of that system that says that, because we don't like you, because we don't think you're a good person, then the law shouldn't apply to you, which is what the Fifth Amendment, which is what this system is intended to do, bring the Fifth Amendment into these proceedings. That seems to me problematic, and I don't know that we would want a system to operate like that. So someone who has a viable defense within the law should be able to bring that viable defense within the law, and that's how the rule of law maintains itself.
So,
well, I guess I'm talking about how our dollars are spent. And I don't think our residents want to see our dollars being spent defending from deportation people with prior convictions, criminal convictions.
So, I mean, I probably should, I'll cede the floor in a second. I hear that, and I understand that, although I'm not convinced, I don't know, I haven't seen the numbers of the data that would support that proposition. And the reason why I say that is because what I hear and what I see in the community is that individuals dislike the fact that there is a basis being used against individuals. For example, President Trump tweets, "I don't like these people," and because he tweets that he doesn't like these people, I want them deported. To me, that if we create a system that excludes individuals because we don't want the law to apply to them, the defense system to apply to them, to me, I think that's a hard line to create a system to do that actually operates and comports with the Fifth Amendment, and using public dollars to create a system that doesn't comport with that idea of equity inclusion. I don't know that people would be against. I don't hear that in the community.
So, I mean, a few points of clarity. Number one, undocumented individuals actually are less likely to commit crime. So it's a myth that I think the Trump administration has done a really great job just criminalizing individuals who are undocumented or have, what's the term? They're not undocumented, but kind of unstable or undetermined status.
In precarious status.
Yes, so they're less likely to commit crimes. If there's an open criminal proceeding, they're actually going to be provided with a defense attorney, which is one of the ironies of this situation to me. If you've done nothing wrong, done nothing but care for your family and contribute to your community, you can be deported and not provided with defense, and that's why we're talking about this today. And then the final question of the priors, I mean, if they've been convicted, they've served their time, it's up for the immigration court to decide whether or not they deserve to stay here, not for our system. And I think I hear what you're saying. It would be highly problematic to try to screen people out based on prior convictions.
Right, I think that's correct. And I don't mean to be disputatious. Like what I think
I'm writing disputatious.
I know, I was like,
I
mental
say
note.
150,000 on law school right there, and that was worth it. That is a gem, disputatious. That is going into my State of the City.
If an individual has a defense, an individual has a defense because the law provides for it. And so what this system is intended to do is to allow the true facts and the true law to apply. And if at the end of the day, the judge says, based on the true facts and the true law, this individual has no remedy, that individual has no remedy. And what happens now without the attorneys, right, is that the asymmetry, right? So we have a system that's asymmetrical and so does not allow the true facts or the true law to apply. And that's why, and so that's the response.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Could I just put
get that.
another question on before the mayor? I know the mayor has to go, and the question is, supposing Washington County, Beaverton, Hillsborough don't chip in as well, Multnomah County does, is this whole system scalable to serve just Portland residents?
Yes.
Yes.
I won't ask for it today, but could I see some of those options?
The
Scalable options.
if we were the only ones.
Yeah, I want to keep all my options open. I mean, I think first of all, I have thoroughly enjoyed this presentation, and you and the work group have done a fantastic job of laying this out. This is a great work session, in my opinion, and thank you, Commissioner, for that. I will be completely transparent. This budget is going to be a very, very challenging budget, and I think we start tonight with our community engagements, and I would encourage everybody to participate. There's a lot of things that are up for grabs. But I want you to hear that I acknowledge and agree with the values that you've established.
Could I just put one more thing in before the mayor goes?
And I can answer that question really quickly. Adding Washington County, adding other jurisdictions is really only a matter of adding numbers to the pool that's being served, right? And so what we're talking about is the number of people that we're serving at Washington, at the Portland Immigration Court. And as we mentioned, right, it's just scaling, larger, smaller.
So the other thing I want you to be thinking about, Mayor, is that when we were doing the grant for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals last year, there was a lot of community support and people saying, I want to give, and it was just with the timeline was so short, led by Kelsa, thank you, Andrea, that we just put the money on the table. But I imagine, I mean, the employers, as you've made the case very well, the families are going to want, it's good for our community. So I think there's a great opportunity for fundraising. And to that end, one of the options we could consider is for us to fund a development director who would then go out and find the rest of the money. I mean, the goal is to get there, but actually, as well as the government helping, our government helping, I think this is an opportunity for the community to say, I really want to do something, I'm sick and tired of what's going on, I can give $500, I can sponsor somebody at $1,700 or whatever. I'm sure that we would get people stepping up.
I mean, the numbers have come down as this plan has been refined, and I think the current proposal would be a combination of funds from the county and the city, and then the subsequent years, hopefully pull in other jurisdictions, fundraise.
I would add to that we are in conversation with a national group called the Vera Institute. And one of the things they are looking for is adding new cities to their legal defense fund. They provide small matching dollars for cities and counties that create these types of deportation defense funds. But one of the stipulations is that we do not have restrictions on the criminal history element that you asked about, because their principles are that everybody has access to a lawyer through immigration court. That is one of their stipulations. So it's something we should take into consideration when we're developing this, is that there are some national groups that are willing to invest at a small level if we get commitment from local governments. And we are also approaching a few other jurisdictions. We're in conversation with the city of Eugene as well, who is the other city who gave some money for DACA. So we're talking to them about this as well, and we're reaching out to Washington County. I would also say that while Washington County numerically looks like they have a larger number of people going through proceedings, as a percentage of the total people, Multnomah County actually has the greatest gap in representation among the 3 counties, which I thought was really surprising. So Clackamas County, between Clackamas County, Washington County, and Multnomah County, we have the greatest.
What resources do people in Washington County have to get representation?
No, I'm saying that the number of people who are going through proceedings, from represented to unrepresented, Multnomah County has the largest number of unrepresented. I'm not saying they have resources per se. When you compare the 3 counties, Multnomah County has the greatest gap.
I'm just wondering why folks because there's double the number of people who've been detained in the last 30 days from Hillsborough, Beaverton, compared with East Portland. Why do those folks have access to representation that
I don't know.
Portland
The
just don't?
data doesn't tell us why. It just shows us that we have, this county has the largest gap among the 3 counties, which is interesting. So I would also say that we are also in conversation with private funders as well, but that's a process, a separate track and separate process.
I can speak a little bit to the prior conviction issue as well.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks, Mayor.
So if we think about the criminal justice system and the deportation system, the criminal justice system is there are 2 different systems and they're set up to do 2 different things. So one of the things I think we expect from the criminal justice system is that once that person's been convicted and punished, right, then they're reintegrated into society. And criminal convictions in deportation proceedings disproportionately impact lawful permanent residents, so people who have been often long-term residents of the United States. What that means is that when the deportation system rests on criminal convictions, it's basically treating U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents differently. And so if we kind of prejudge the results of that deportation proceeding, based on a prior criminal conviction, we're not providing any opportunity for that person to use any of the possibilities for relief for creating status or maintaining their lawful permanent status. It's just cutting that ability off early on. And the other thing unlike the criminal justice system, the deportation system is a toggle system. It's either deportation or nothing. So the Supreme Court in a case called Padilla versus Kentucky characterized deportation as a kind of punitive sanction. It doesn't say it's criminal punishment, but it says deportation is like a punitive sanction. And so we need to be really careful about how the criminal justice system affects the deportation system. So if we cut that opportunity off early by telling people they're not going to be part of this system, we're making that decision that should actually be made within the deportation system itself.
So I'm hearing you, and I like what you've put together as a proposal, but I'm still, and maybe I just need to be educated more, but I'm still not totally assured. I think there needs to be some sort of a bright line. I don't think we should be spending our dollars to have people with convictions for rape, manslaughter, anything a serious felony, or felonies, should be eligible for our dollars to help their defense. And like I said, I don't understand the whole process, so maybe, and you don't have to educate me right here, right now, but between now and when we make any kind of a final vote on this, I'm still looking for some bright line there.
Well, challenging though is that there are different kinds of felonies, aren't there? So cannabis convictions, some of them were felonies, then wouldn't be convictions now. So if you are looking for a bright line, I think that would be a discussion that would have to happen is where is the line?
What is a serious felony, I guess, as opposed to a cannabis conviction? Yeah.
Right, and that's very difficult. And what I'll just say is that federal immigration law provides for a system of looking at convictions and determining whether certain convictions make a person deportable, whether it makes a person ineligible for relief and not, right? And that was what I kind of referenced earlier in it being a very complex system. So there's a whole section of the code that says, okay, these are the crimes that make you subject to deportation if you weren't already. Or these are the crimes that say, okay, you can't apply for these forms of relief if you have one of these convictions. And so by going through that process, that decision is going to be made whether or not the government has decided these crimes are already serious, right? So the U.S. Attorney General, Congress have already sat down and said, these are all the types of crimes that we think that make people shouldn't be eligible. So if we set out an additional carve-out that says, no, these folks, we're adding to that. And really what we're adding to is a criminalization of folks, right? The most potent tool that the Trump administration uses to marginalize people of color and to marginalize immigrant communities is criminalization. And if we cede that territory to Trump, if we say, okay, sure, take the criminals and we'll just work with the good immigrants, we've lost it. That's no longer universal representation.
I guess I'd like to see that section of code you just referred to that lays out those.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you can.
I think you can probably recite it.
Well, if you can send it to us or whatever.
Some statistics would be really helpful. I don't know how significant this population of people without legal status who have committed felonies is, so we may be debating a nominal percentage of the overall budget. And yeah, I think the cost to us, and as Andrea mentioned, we may qualify for funding, other funding streams, but not if we kind of discriminated against people with former convictions. Still, the cost of what is being done to our communities so outstrips the public dollars we're talking about putting in. We're talking about $500,000 from the city versus an undetermined but much larger amount of money that we are spending on supporting these families who are being destabilized.
And I hear the question and I hear the concern, and I think we all do. And so what may be a good resolution at this point is I think I'd like to take you up on both of your offers to come back and to continue the conversation on both the what sort of the population that we're talking about, as well as different options, as well as maintaining integrity, what we think within a system, a rule of law system. So.
And the request is $1 million. Did I?
It's
not a half.
Between the county and the city.
Oh.
Yeah.
We also have a draft of a budget if you wanted to see the nitty-gritty on that we can email you.
Okay.
It's a draft, so.
Okay.
But it's very well outlined.
Yeah, I'd like to see it.
Yeah. I'm a visual person, so it helps me as well.
I have a quick question. It's tangentially related. So the last Nazi war criminal who lives in the U.S., lives in Queens, he's in his 90s. He's been, I guess, deported, but no country affiliated with this person, Poland, Germany, and I can't remember the third country, will take him. So he's just comfortably living in Queens. What happens if, have you seen that happen before, where you're assisting someone through a deportation proceeding, they're deported, and there's nowhere for them to go?
Yes. There's actually a Supreme Court case originating here out of Portland called Clark v. Martinez with those, not with those facts, but with that very same legal issue that was created. And at the time, pre-Clark v. Martinez, the government would just detain those individuals indefinitely without end. And then the Supreme Court said that you can't do that. That actually violates the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. And so that ended. And that was in a case of an individual from Cuba, because at the time, the U.S. did not have diplomatic relationships with Cuba, and Cuba was not issuing there was no ability for the government to actually to remove that person to Cuba. are the individuals who are stateless. So there's no, like in Europe when there was a lot of, some countries no longer exist, right? Or the lines of the countries got changed, and so no one's claiming jurisdiction over that individual. That it's not an uncommon occurrence for an individual. If you're not able to claim the U.S., right, as your home, there may be no other place that would recognize your home.
Can't imagine. Any other questions?
I just think one thing that needs to be said is that this country doesn't have reasonable, enforceable immigration laws. It's very difficult to be here legally. And so that is a reality that I don't think a lot of people who have lived here all their lives understand. But it was, as 20% of the city council is an immigrant, it's not easy to do things correctly. I vividly remember taking the bus from New Jersey to Montreal to change my visa, because you can't change from a student visa to a work visa or back again while you're in this country. Multiple other indignities and challenges doing things the right way. So there are so many people in our community who do deserve to be here and just may have missed a form or didn't realize that they, whatever. And that's why this is, to me, both personal and urgent. And there are a lot of other people who are unrepresented in our community as well. And Commissioner Saltzman's work at the Domestic Violence Centre and the work that we're doing there, I think we need to also look at how do we tie in the Gateway Centre, are there resources there? You obviously know a bazillion times more about it than I do. Are there opportunities for partnering so that some of those additional costs might be shared? It's an opportunity for their navigators to help in this system. Because what we really need is a system that works in these very challenging times. And so I don't think Portland can do it by itself. So I'm going to be very interested to hear what Montgomery County, what their response is. I know that they also provide lots of social services and services to people who they don't care whether they have papers or not. They are going to look after them. I don't know if anybody saw John Oliver on HBO over the weekend, who did a segment on immigration and how many children are the targets of these proceedings. You know, you mentioned about the 3-year-old, and it was him and his father. I mean, how much worse had it been just the 3-year-old? It's a huge problem, and so I wanted to thank you for bringing it to our attention. Thank you, Commissioner Daly, for having this work session, and also acknowledging that we do have, as the Mayor said, a very, very challenging budget. So we're cutting services for immigrants and refugees in the Parks Department, for example, should the budget go through. We're increasing charges for community gardens. We're cutting community centres. We are desperately trying to serve everybody in our community with not enough funds. And so I don't know what the outcome of this request is going to be. I just wanted to let you know that I do care passionately about the situation, and I hope we can do something.
Thank you, Commissioner, for those words.
Thank you.
All right.
Can I say one more thing about that? It's just the idea that when we're thinking about where to put money in Portland, this is really a question not just about taking care of our community, but actually keeping community members in Portland. So that has to be the highest priority in my mind, is to actually maintaining people, keeping people from leaving, right?
I invite you to come to the budget meeting tonight, because you know it all is supposed to work together, and you can't. Yes, there's a lot of life and death things in the city's budget, of things that we are responsible for, that we're being asked to fund, and some of them we're going to be able to fund and some of them not. So I think we also need to look at where can we get more money, and that's why I made the suggestion on engaging our community. I think of the Muslim Educational Trust, both at the beginning of the year when they had a forum about immigration, and I learned that even as a citizen now, because I'm a naturalized citizen, I am at risk for deportation. There were 1,000 people there that night. And again, after the Max killings, there were 1,000 people there, and millions of dollars raised to support the community after that tragedy. So we, I believe, have to engage the funds within our community as well as the hearts and minds within our community. And I think we can do it. There's times when government has to do it, and that's what we did for DACA. I think this is an opportunity to really engage people and saying, yeah, you can do something, whether it's, the products of your lemonade stand or funding one undocumented worker through the system. I think we need to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
I
very
guess
much.
we're adjourned. I don't know if we adjourn work sessions, but just to be official.